Next slide, please. So our agenda for this portion of the webinar is to do an introduction and overview, including why we published the ATB and an overview of what is in the ATB. Then we'll talk about updates for 2024, including changes affecting all technologies, changes to the financial cases and methods, and we'll hear from 5 technology-specific updates with larger changes. Then we'll have some time for Q&A in the main webinar, and then we'll move to the breakout groups. Next slide. So why the ATB? Ever-changing technologies result in conflicting reports of technology progress based on inconsistent and often opaque assumptions. A single data set is needed to credibly and transparently assess the evolving state of energy technologies in the United States, and the ATB enables understanding technology cost and performance across energy sectors, and thus informs electric sector analysis nationwide. Next slide. While we are in the electricity ATB webinar, electricity is not the only ATB that NREL publishes. We've also published the transportation ATB for 2020 and 2022, and you can find a link to that on atb.nrel.gov, or we have direct links to electricity and transportation that will direct you to the most recent year, which are currently on the slide. Next slide. The transportation ATB includes core data around fuel economy, vehicle price, fuel cost, fuel emissions, financial assumptions, and the levelized cost of driving and emissions from a variety of vehicle types. This is all available at atb.nrel.gov and includes the product suite that you've come to know and associate with the ATB. And I'm pleased to announce that the transportation ATB will be doing a 2024 update in the next few months. If you want to be the first to know about that, you can sign up on the contact link on the ATB website if you haven't already. Next slide. So for an overview of the ATB, next slide. The ATB anchors key US Department of Energy and national lab analyses. It's used in tools and models such as the resource planning model, the regional energy deployment system, and the system advisor model. And then those tools and ATB data are used in reports such as evaluating the impacts of the Inflation Reduction Act and bipartisan infrastructure law, LA 100, standard scenarios, and the storage future study. Next slide, please. This is the 10th release of the ATB, and the ATB is frequently used by planners, academics, analysts, and others. This includes federal agencies, grid operators, utilities, consultants, academia, and many more. And what's on this slide is just examples of users. This is not at all a comprehensive list. Next slide. The ATB data are inputs for the standard scenarios. So ATB presents cost and performance assumptions for renewable and conventional technologies. And then going into the late fall or winter, standard scenarios is released, which is an ensemble of future scenarios for the US electric power sector. Next slide. The electricity ATB includes a suite of products, including the spreadsheet, which currently has cost and performance projections for 2022 through 2050, the web app at atb.nrel.gov, interactive charts, Tableau workbook, and a formatted data in machine-readable formats for all of the data that the ATB provides. This PowerPoint presentation, which will be posted on the ATB website. And since the last webinar, we released open source code in the ATB Calc GitHub repository that allows you to do some of the financial calculations within the ATB, such as debt fractions, and allows for updating some of the assumptions around tax credits. Next slide. The ATB provides cost and performance data. So we start with a base year in 2022, which is based on empirical market data for technologies that are in the market. And that includes metrics such as CapEx, O&M costs, and capacity factor. And then we project those for 2050. Those are provided for each year in the data set, for each resource class or technology detail in the data set, across all of the technologies that the ATB provides. And we have 3 different cost scenarios. We project those through 2050 and then combine those with financial assumptions to calculate the levelized cost of energy. Next slide. These are the technologies that are covered in the ATB. New technologies are in the bold brown font, including pumped storage hydropower using existing reservoirs, a new natural gas combined cycle configuration, and new data for nuclear. Next slide. The methodology defines resource bins for each technology. So we group ranges of resources for the contiguous United States into bins with common resource quality, such as solar insolation or wind speed, or for plants where that doesn't apply, such as natural gas or nuclear, we develop representative plants. Within those bins, we then develop cost performance data. This includes base year and projected values across 3 technology advancement scenarios: conservative, moderate, and advanced, across the metrics such as CapEx, capacity factor, and O&M. And then we combine those with financial assumptions in order to calculate the levelized cost of energy. Next slide. So as an example of the technology bins, on the left, we have a map of North America with wind speed in various grades of blue, depending on the wind speed. And then these are grouped into the ATB wind classes, which are not to scale in this example, but showing that we tend to have a little bit more density on the left in higher wind speeds where plants are more likely to get built, and a little bit less on the right with that supply curve of wind speed versus cumulative capacity. Next slide. So these are how those bins are defined for each technology. So we just saw the example of average annual wind speed. I'm not going to read all of these. This deck will be published afterwards if you want to go into detail, but I will note that the bins changed in 2024 for offshore wind, which we'll hear more about later, pumped storage hydropower, in adding those 1 new reservoir technologies, natural gas, and nuclear. And we'll hear about more of those from all of the analysts later. Next slide. Then within those bins, we develop cost and performance data. The base year of 2022 is informed by market reports, market data, and bottom-up modeling. Projections generally rely on bottom-up modeling and published studies, and those are then qualitatively harmonized to 3 scenarios of future technology innovation. The conservative scenario assumes today's technology with little innovation. Continued industrial learning drives some cost declines, and generally this represents a decrease in public and private research and development relative to current levels. The moderate technology innovation scenario represents widespread adoption of today's cutting-edge technology. Represents the expected level of innovation from the ATB analysts and assumes that current levels of public and private R&D continue. And then we also present an advanced technology innovation scenario, which assumes market success of currently unproven innovations, potential for new technology architectures, and an increase in public and private R&D relative to current levels. Next slide. Again, a lot of detail on this slide. I'm not going to read the whole thing, but generally speaking, this outlines the sources of base year data, including cost and performance reports from around the DOE lab complex. So you can see specific examples of the reports that we use to generate this data and the vintage of the data for the base year. Next slide. And then we use that to calculate the levelized cost of energy, including financial assumptions in the fixed charge rate, as well as tax credits. LCOE is a summary metric which can summarize the decrease in costs due to multiple technology innovations, such as either decreasing CapEx or increasing capacity factor, but it does have important limitations which we document on the website. Next slide. So with that, I'll summarize the changes that we made to all technologies for the 2024 ATB. Next slide. So the biggest change in some of our definitions of some of these metrics is our change to grid connection costs. Previous editions of the ATB, it just had a default line where you could input your own grid connection costs into the LCOE calculation that was 0 for all technologies except for offshore wind. We did a bit of digging based on some user questions and found that prior years were a little bit inconsistent about where costs such as spur lines and interconnection studies were categorized. So for an example, the PV technology included interconnection costs in their overnight capital costs, but some other technologies did not. So for this year, we're now consistent about all front of meter technologies now include nominal grid connection costs of $100 per kilowatt. That is meant to represent the spur line connecting from the plant gate to the point of interconnection, some upgrades at the point of interconnection, and some network upgrades. It may not be all of the network upgrades that portion of the grid is undergoing, but it does have some nominal network upgrades. And this means that we have a clean representation of overnight capital costs that stops at the plant gate, but we're still representing some nominal grid connection costs close to a load center in the levelized cost of energy. Technologies besides offshore wind do not vary by resource classification, so you're going to see consistent costs regardless of the resource. We'll note that interconnection costs are extremely site-specific, and other NREL tools such as REV and READS account for this site-specific variation in the solar and wind technologies. Next slide. Here's a visual representation of what is included in each component. So the blue boxes on the map represent overnight capital costs at the specific plant. So that's costs like balance of system, on-site electrical equipment, generation equipment, and site owners and indirect costs. That's, again, very similar to the definition of overnight capital costs from prior ATBs. It just more consistently excludes some of these grid connection costs. And so within that grid connection cost, the black line circles what we're intending to represent there, with the spur line between the plant and existing transmission, any upgrades at the point of interconnection, and some network upgrades that might be assigned by an interconnection study. Again, all of this is very plant specific, and we recommend looking at those specific costs for your plant. I did see a question just pop up. Yes, the grid connection costs are included in overall CapEx costs, not just LCOE. So we are also applying construction financing to these costs as well. Next slide. So another change this year are some of our nascent technologies are changing the start years that they're represented. So Patrick will talk more about this later, but we're now representing floating offshore wind starting just with costs in 2030. We have two different types of costs that plants in the ATB may represent. So depending on how the analysts have completed their cost projections, and this is all documented on the website, they may fall into a next commercial offering cost class, which assumes that the first of a kind plant costs have already happened, or they may represent pilot costs in which you can see the cost declines from a pilot plant to a next commercial offering to nth of a kind throughout the ATB data. So enhanced geothermal has its start year in 2022, and those do represent pilot plant costs. Small modular nuclear has also updated its start year to 2030 and has adopted next commercial offering. Carbon capture and storage costs start in 2022 and represent next commercial offering with those costs. And natural gas fuel cells start in 2035 and represent next commercial offering with those costs. So this is just a handy summary reference. The analysts go into much more detail on the website into how those are categorized and what is considered next commercial offering versus first of a kind for these nascent technologies. Next slide. All right, next I'd like to discuss the financial cases and methods update. Next slide. So we represent two financial cases in the ATB. The R&D financial case has constant financials throughout the analysis period. We set up technology-specific debt, interest rates, debt fractions, return on equity, and exclude the tax credits that these technologies are eligible for. And then we hold those assumptions constant throughout the analysis period. So this allows, when you're looking at the levelized cost of energy, to just see the effects of technology innovation. We also present a markets and policies scenario, which also has some of these technology-specific aspects, such as debt interest and return on equity. But then we also add in the effects of the tax credits in the Inflation Reduction Act, such as the investment tax credit and the production tax credit. And then this affects the debt fraction that we represent and the relative cost of capital required to monetize the tax credits. So there are toggles on the website for toggling between these. Generally on charts that we're about to show in the presentation, if you see this little R&D up in the upper circle, that means we're looking at the R&D case without the tax credits. And if you see market in that circle, then you're looking at just the markets case, including the credits. Next slide. So As we typically do with each ATB update, we advance the base year and the dollar year. So for the 2024 ATB, we present a base year of 2022, and all data in units of dollars, either in the data set or on the website, is in 2022 dollars. So if you're looking for a 2024 cost, you'll need to apply recent inflation. If you're looking to project further, you'll need to have some projection of inflation that you apply to the data. Everything is in real dollars for 2022 dollars. We updated our financial assumptions to apply things more consistently to more technologies. So we now include construction financing costs for batteries. Previous editions of the ATB just presented overnight capital costs for batteries. We now have CapEx to include that construction financing. And for utility scale batteries, the grid connection costs I was mentioning before. One of the larger financial changes is the Inflation Reduction Act tax credits remain through 2050. So the 2023 standard scenarios included additional load growth from electrification. And that means that in 13 out of 17 scenarios, the electric sector never hits the 25% carbon reduction from 2022 threshold in the Inflation Reduction Act. And therefore the tax credits stay throughout the analysis period for those 13 out of 17 scenarios. If you want more information of that, I encourage you to read the standard scenarios report. But what it means is that for the 2024 ATB, the markets case always includes the tax credits. We don't represent the phase out. For your own use of these data, I would recommend basically if you assume the tax credits have phased out, look at the financial assumptions and LCOE for the R&D case in that year for whatever year after 2032 you anticipate the credits phasing out. Or if you assume the tax credits are in, go with the markets case. We don't have specific cases for the phase out itself, but that's something that you could potentially calculate by adjusting the tax credits in the spreadsheet and recalculating the debt fractions using the ATB calc repository. With all of that said, the final financial update is we updated the after-tax equity returns. We gathered a larger set of data that better incorporated the impacts of the Inflation Reduction Act in 2023, and generally saw a slight decline in equity returns for all technologies. So you can see the declines for a representative set of technologies here. Typically, things are down between 0.25% or a full percentage point for most technologies, and we think this better represents industry data relative to last year. Next slide. So the following slides compare financial assumptions used to calculate the levelized cost of energy. So we have a slide showing the investment tax credits and production tax credits for which technology chooses each. What is the debt fraction on term debt for that technology, weighted average cost of capital, and then finally LCOE. Next slide. So this shows the assumptions around production tax credits and investment tax credits. So we still see a few technologies transitioning from a pre-IRA tax credit regime to post, with some of the technologies changing in 2023. Also noteworthy is nuclear taking the carbon neutral tax credit starting in 2025 in the markets case. And then, as I mentioned before, all technologies except for distributed PV, which has a firm phase out date regardless of the carbon reduction thresholds, continue throughout the analysis period. I know this chart's a little bit busy with a lot of technologies overlapping. So if you go to the financial assumptions page on the ATB website, we have a more detailed chart of what's happening in each year. And there's also a tax credits page within the ATB spreadsheet that again has all of this detailed data. We selected these tax credits based on what provided the lowest levelized cost of energy for technology in the base year. I'll note that that may change depending on how technology costs evolve. So depending on the detail of your analysis, you may choose to make that dynamic if you have that level of detail. Next slide. This shows the impacts on debt fraction for each of the two cases. So generally speaking, technologies have a lower debt fraction when they need to monetize tax credits than they do in the R&D case where the tax credits are not present. I would also flag that the technologies that are taking the production tax credit, such as land-based wind and utility scale PV, show a declining debt fraction over time. And that shows that in order to monetize those tax credits, they need an increasing percentage of equity as costs decline. So the absolute amount of equity might decrease, but the percentage of the full project tends to increase over time of equity. Debt fraction decreases. Next slide. This shows the effects on the weighted average cost of capital. So again, similarly in the markets case, technologies with increasing debt fraction, equity is more expensive than debt. So the weighted average cost of capital for those technologies increases over time. And again, tends to be higher in the markets case than the R&D case due to that increased equity share. Next slide. And then this shows the effects on levelized cost of energy. We have a little bit more flexibility in breaking out things by tax credit on the website. So it's very explicit here. So a lot of technologies are taking the investment tax credit, and that's the box on the furthest left. So you can see the cost declines in the markets case with the investment tax credit. Land-based wind and utility scale PV are showing the production tax credit in that box second from the left. Third from the left, we offer the option to analyze PV plus storage, assuming that PV can take the PTC and the storage component can take the ITC. So essentially filing taxes for those projects filing the taxes for that plant as two separate projects. Or you can look at PV plus battery with ITC only, which matches the 2023 ATB. And then finally, you can see the higher levelized costs of energy associated with the R&D case on the far right. Next slide. So at this point, we're ready to get into some of the technology-specific updates. Next slide. So this slide summarizes all of the technology-specific updates analysts will be hearing from over the next few minutes, have their technologies underlined. So for this slide, the first update we'll hear from is offshore wind. Next slide. And then we'll also be hearing from geothermal, pumped storage hydropower, natural gas and coal, and nuclear. Next slide. And with that, I'll hand things off to Patrick Duffy to discuss the offshore wind updates.
Thanks, Brian. All right, so for offshore wind energy, we've made two significant changes to the methodology. The first one is a short-term capital cost correction, which we've applied to all scenarios, but the duration of this correction varies depending on the scenario. And this is intended to better reflect the experience of the industry with respect to higher costs from inflation, supply chain disruptions, and higher interest rates. We've applied this correction both to fixed bottom and floating offshore wind energy, which results in higher project capex. Year over year, we're seeing around a 30% higher LCOE in 2022 and 8% higher LCOE in 2035 for the fixed bottom offshore wind energy moderate case. Next slide, please. The other significant change that we made this year was a methodology change to the way we project floating offshore wind energy costs. So we've really focused on trying to better capture the cost impacts of technology maturation over time. And so this year we've opted to present floating offshore wind energy costs from 2030 on, when the first gigawatt scale projects could feasibly be built in the US. And this change also leads to higher costs through the early 2030s, but demonstrates a more aggressive cost reduction potential as the industry matures. So this results in a 35% higher LCOE compared to the 2023 ATB in 2035 for the moderate floating offshore wind energy case. And I also want to highlight that this technology maturation really depends on the pace of global deployment. And so we connect that pace of global deployment to the level of investments implicitly in the infrastructure supporting those projects, which help to drive down costs through the learning process and de-risk the technology. And the US West Coast and Northeast floating offshore wind projects could play a key role in helping to mature the technologies and bring the cost down. Next slide. So this is just an illustration of the 2024 offshore wind energy estimates, you'll now notice that the floating offshore wind technology is presented in a separate pane and starts from 2030, as I mentioned. Next slide. I do want to also highlight the impact of investment tax credit between, and this is really driving the differences between the market scenario and the research and development financing scenario. Next slide.
Thanks, Patrick. I'm not seeing any burning questions from the audience on offshore wind. So if you have questions, please type them in and Patrick will either respond to the chat or we'll hold them for the end of the session. So with that, I'll hand things off to Dio for geothermal.
Thanks, Brian. Hi, everyone. So for geothermal, we usually use the Getter model for our ATB work. The Getter model is an Excel-based bottom-up cost model that takes into account the different stages of geothermal plant development, from exploration down to eventual plant operations. And for the projections beyond 2022, we assumed this year a conservative, for the conservative case, a 0.5% annual decline in cost from the base year up to 2050. And then for the moderate case, we assume an 18% learning rate from the base year to 2035, and then a 0.5 decline afterwards. And for the advanced case, which we updated specifically for the EGS systems, we kept the hydrothermal as we did have in the 2023 ATB, but we increased the EGS learning rate slightly from 30% to 35%. And this is because of the in-project learnings we've been seeing based off of industry drilling project. And so we increased that EGS learning rate to 35%. And for the major changes we made in FY25, first we aligned the near field and DPGS representative plant sizes. Previously, they had, there was a dichotomy between near field, which had 30 megawatts, which had 40 megawatts, and the DPGS, which had 20 and 30 megawatts, depending on whether it's flash or binary. And so we aligned them to be 30 and 40 for binary and flash for the conservative case, and just 40 megawatts for the moderate case. We also tried to represent the ongoing successes in terms of drilling performance in demonstration projects, both the ones that have been sponsored by the DOE and also industry pilot project. And so we made a slight decrease in the drilling cost of about 7%. And this is in addition to the 3% decline that was introduced in 2020 in the 2021 ATB. And so overall, we're now at 10% below the baseline drilling cost curve. And so this had significant impact in the cost, as you would see later. And we also provided or changed the flow rates for the EGS. And also this in turn impacted the injectivity as well. So we increased the flow rate from 40 to 60 kilograms per second to be able to represent what the successful demonstration that Fervo actually implemented in their Blue Mountain project. Next slide, please. And these impacted both the hydrothermal and also the DPGS. On your left, you would see the hydrothermal flash curve, which for the base year, we're currently at about 70-ish dollars per megawatt hour. And then for the DPGS, we had a significant decline in LCOE from about 400 to about $200 per megawatt hour. And so please move to the next slide. You would see the significant changes to especially to the EGS plants. And this, I would mention, this is majorly based on improvements in the reservoir performance, as well as decline in the drilling cost based off of rates of penetrations that are more than double what has been used in the previous ATBs. And so there's been at least a 55% decline in a lot of the costs for, especially for the EGS. Next slide, please. And also this applies to the binary systems as well. We see a significant drop in the capex, for example, for near field from about $30 per kilowatt to about $15-ish per kilowatt for the near field EGS. And so I would like to also mention that although we've seen this major cost in the last cost decline in the last couple of years, we anticipate that for the remaining years, we are most likely going to not see these huge drops in cost because it's starting to level out in terms of except there is a disruptive technology that significantly improves drilling and stimulation, we may not necessarily see these huge drops as we go forward. And I think that's all for geothermal. Hand it over to Stuart.
Thanks, Dio. Before we hand it over to Stuart, there was one question that I'll rephrase slightly. Do you have any insights as to how geothermal costs would change, assuming that old oil and gas wells are used? Colorado developed a database of bottom hole temperatures for thousands of existing wells.
We haven't considered using oil and gas wells for the ATB. We are using basically geothermal type systems, whether they are hydrothermal or EGS type technologies, where you basically either a greenfield, right? And if it's a brown field, we have some existing geothermal wells, and then we go drill other wells. Utilizing oil and gas wells is still early days, and it there's data coming up, and there's a couple of projects that are trying to do this, but it's still for the ATB, it's even more nascent than the EGS. So possibly in the future we can consider those types of technologies as well, but for now we don't.
Thanks, Dio. All right, at this point I'll hand things off to Stuart.
Great, thanks a lot. So the major changes for pump storage hydropower for this year are, one, that we actually recently released a new bottom-up cost model that I already see a question is available online, and I'll talk a little bit more about that. And then the other thing is that we updated our resource assessment to include sites that can utilize existing reservoirs. So this is where you would only have to build one new reservoir, connect to the existing reservoir, instead of building a new closed loop site that has two new reservoirs. We haven't done anything to the cost projections. We do have some ongoing work thinking about that, but no changes for this year on ATB. Next slide. So the first thing I'll point out, and so we have resource assessment and supply curve webpage for the pump storage hydropower that actually includes site level data, so you can look at this geospatially and filter and explore around. And if you go to this website, you'll see now that it has these kind of blue outlined existing reservoirs paired with new reservoirs that you can explore. And so when you see the new technology category on ATB, it's essentially a binning of these site level results. Next slide. And then on the cost model, and so right now it's been developed as a pretty detailed, highly technical spreadsheet tool. And so this looks a little bit ugly. There's even more if you actually download the tool. But if you go on that website, you can open up the spreadsheet, and it gives you the opportunity to input any kind of site-specific parameters, as well as change different assumptions about the site design, and it actually builds you up a bottom-up cost model. And so this was developed in partnership with industry stakeholders, particularly HDR did a lot of assistance in helping us build this, and it's based on largely on some EPRI cost assessment methodology. And so this is essentially part of the back end of that resource assessment tool from the previous slide, where we develop site level costs that then get binned up. And so this is a change from previous years where we were using a much simpler parametric model that was developed by Australian National University. Next slide. And so when you bin everything up, a couple things that you might notice difference from this year is you'll see that the sites with existing reservoirs are logically lower cost than sites that require 2 new reservoirs. But I do just want to point out one limitation in that is that we're not assuming any kind of additional retrofit costs or things you have to do to modify the existing reservoirs. That would be highly site specific and require a lot of working with specific operators and owners to figure out what those costs would be. And so that's not that's not data that exists right now. So one limitation there is that those costs might be, optimistic for those particular sites. And the next slide, I think it's the last one I have. And the big thing that you'll notice from year on year with the new cost model is that the costs are much higher. And I think couple reasons for that. One is that the higher level of detail does give us I believe more accuracy and robustness in assessing individual costs, but we also worked a lot with industry to get better assumptions for indirect cost rates. So like entering in procurement costs and labor mobilization costs and things like that. And so we feel a lot more confident in those estimates, and those have a pretty big impact on ultimately what you assume as your final capital costs. So I believe that is all I have, and pass it over to nuclear.
Hey everyone, so I'm Abdul Jari from Idaho National Lab. We had a team-based effort to provide a new update for the ATB on nuclear cost estimates. In the previous ATB releases, it was based on the AEO 222 reference scenarios from the EIA. We recently published a report that's been out since March. You can find the link here. We can paste it in the chat too. It's all our numbers are normalized $2022. We basically compiled a pretty comprehensive list of detailed cost estimates for SMRs and large reactor based on observed costs, but SMRs, since we haven't built them yet, based on detailed cost estimates primarily commissioned for the DOE. We then processed, compiled, escalated. I saw a question here about inflation and escalation. We have a detailed methodology for how we did that and handled that in our report. You can find out more over there. And then we compiled all this data, normalize them to a similar code of account. We primarily prioritize bottom-up cost estimates rather than high-level numbers where we didn't really know necessarily what was included, what was not. And then anything that was missing, we made sure to include, for instance, owner costs, things that are indirect costs that are usually a bit more tricky to evaluate. We made sure to augment data sets that didn't have them with these kinds of values. We predicted our costs based on a learning rate methodology and deployment scenarios for nuclear. So we have recommended learning rates in our report that we'd encourage you to use. But if your capacity expansion model or whatever energy mix modeling you need to do requires cost evolutions over time, we have different scenarios for how many nuclear deployments happen, and we multiply these values by the learning rates we recommend to provide projected cost estimates for nuclear. Next slide. So the costs are divided between large reactors, so that's a nominal power of 1,000 megawatt electric, and small modular reactors, 300 megawatt electrics. The small modular reactors in particular are technology agnostic. We did not have enough data set at this point to make a case about whether gas cooled or light water cooled or sodium cooled reactor would be cheaper or more expensive than the other. And it's also unclear which one of them necessarily will pan out in the future. There's a few of them being developed and demonstrated right now. It's not necessarily clear which one of them will dominate the market. So we kept things a bit agnostic. We provide CapEx costs, O&M costs, and also additional considerations like construction duration. There was a question in the chat. We don't include licensing duration, but we do include commissioning duration as well in our estimates. And our report contains other things beyond things that are required for ATB, like applicability of subsidies, non-electric applications, so heat applications, for instance, coal to nuclear transition considerations, things of that nature as well. A multi-unit correction factor, so if you have more than one reactor at a given site, usually your cost can be cheaper on top of learning as well due to synergies. Things of that nature are all provided in the report. All of our numbers start by 2030. This was a question also in the chat. It's based on the DOE Advanced Reactor Demonstration Projects, or ARDP, timelines, and also the Canadian OPG project. So I should mention that we account for projections for the US and Canada. The reason for that is that they're a very tight supply chain, and learning happening in one country is expected to spill over to the other. A case in point is OPG and TVA, a Canadian and American utility, have formed a consortium to build a specific design of a nuclear reactor. And we provide conservative, moderate, and advanced scenarios for all the new technology types. Next slide. Just highlighting here the changes compared to the previous model. As you can see, our numbers in red start in 2030 now. This is just based on the timeline that it will take to license and demonstrate new reactors realistically. And our numbers line up for O&M for the most part, and LCOEs tend to be somewhat close to the first part, but our moderate scenario expect a larger deployment of nuclear in the long run and cost decrease more rapidly in the 2040s era. Primarily, this is due of the larger deployment rates and the new climate now with nuclear being eligible for subsidies as well. And the last thing to point out is the definition of SMRs in the old model, old ATB update, sorry. It was 600 megawatt electric. Now we're using the 300 megawatt electric reference. We think that's more representative of SMR concepts making their way towards demonstration in the near term. And with that, I think that's the last slide for nuclear. If you go to the next slide, I'll leave it to fossil fuels.
I'm not seeing any burning questions for nuclear, so Jeff, please go ahead with fossil technology updates.
Excuse me. So good morning, everyone. Talk a little bit about the fossil technologies in the ATB for 2024. It's primarily a cost year update from the additions from the release in ATB 2023. The technology, cost and performance technologies for near term are intended to be representative of commercial offerings for non-capture technologies and next commercial offerings for capture equipped technologies, which do not account for first of a kind costs, but are also not fully representative of the improvements that can occur over time through deployment. For 2024, the new addition is the addition of the H-class one-on-one configuration, both with and without capture, which is intended to reflect a configuration that is not as large as the two-on-one H-class configurations, which approach and exceed a gigawatt for NGCC configured or NGCC configuration, and is meant to reflect smaller deployment of advanced higher efficiency technologies at smaller scale to address the growing need for smaller configurations. Projections looking forward are representative of advancements through targeted FE R&D, improvements in the steam cycle conditions rolling into advanced ultra supercritical conditions, and improvements on capture systems for both new systems and retrofits, decreased cost, decrease in steam duty, and improvements in other aspects of the technology. And all of these are documented in the cited references. There is also the inclusion, and this was a new addition for the 2023 ATB is a separate trajectory, which is meant to be reflective of deployment of advanced natural gas fuel cell electricity generation technologies. Next slide, please. And so what's represented in the ATB are CapEx, VOM, fixed O&M, and heat rate. What is not reflected or calculated in the ATB for the fossil technologies are levelized cost of electricity. And that's purely because it's a function of fuel prices and capacity deployment. And there's sufficient information for users to develop their own, but there is not inclusion of levelized cost of electricity for the fossil plants in the ATB. This slide is meant to just show and reflect the transitions over time in terms of cost and performance for the 3 technology scenarios. The important thing to recognize is that for the advanced technologies, their timing of availability is in the 2030s, early to mid 2030s, and that's reflective of the inflection point that is apparent on these slides. What's represented here are the coal technologies, both mature and nascent. And nascent is, how these technologies align with the specific NREL definitions for the 2 buckets. And same for the natural gas on the right. Next slide, please. And again, just to reflect to illustrate and show the changes over time. We'll own these types of rollouts are not the place to find oopses. I think it's more apparent the next slide. You can see a little bit on the coal on this side, but next slide, please. So when you look at the coal retrofits, you see a little bit of a discontinuity and an anomaly in the 2030 2035 timeframe. That something I was just looking at is reflective of a copy paste error that duplicated the timing of the technology available. So there's 2 years that are exactly the same. So work on fixing that, and unfortunately we'll have to adjust. I think that's all I have for the slides.
Thanks, Jeff. I think you sort of answered this tangentially already, but just to be explicit for this participant, are 45Q tax credits for CCS included anywhere in the ATB?
So what is included in the ATB are the cost and performance assumptions, and the tax credits are not reflected in the financial assumptions.
Thanks. And can you clarify the size? I'll just read the question. For the fossil technology, do you include 1x1 F-type combined cycle with greater than 300 to 350 megawatt size?
So there is no 1x1 F class. There are 2x1 F class and H class, and 1x1 H class.
All right, thank you. All right, with that, I think we'll go to the next slide. So we have a little bit of back matter here. So the complete list of references, including where all the underlying reports came from, is available on the ATB website. Next slide. We have our list of acronyms and abbreviations that were used throughout the presentation. Next slide. I would like to acknowledge all of the analysts who contributed to the work. You've heard from a small sample today, but this is a much larger team. You'll be hearing from many of these people in the breakout rooms, and thanks to all of them for making the ATB possible. Next slide. And with that, thank you. I think we're ready for Q&A. While Laura is pulling up the questions that we're going to ask live, I will mention, Jeff said there were those 2 data points were the same. We do issue errata for the ATB when we find things like that, and we are planning an errata update that affects both the offshore wind and the 97% CCS costs, as well as that retrofit issue that Jeff spotted. We didn't quite manage to get that out before the webinar. That was our original goal, but we do expect that to come out sometime this week. So again, keep an eye on your inbox if you're on that ATB email list, and we will email you when that is updated. And if you see anything that looks like an error, we absolutely encourage you to contact us because sometimes it is.
Hi, Brian. So there have been a lot of great questions on the chat, and I'd like to start off with one about the caveats around the levelized cost of electricity generation, and that may also be a good opportunity to answer a question about environmental effects estimation as well.
Yes, so the question was about increased requirements for storage as renewable deployment increases. So the answer to this is, given the data that we're presenting in the ATB, LCOE is as far as we can take the metrics. So we don't have any assumptions about system dispatch or other system level issues that would address those system costs associated with deployment. So for those metrics like LACE and value of LCOE, we recommend going to standard scenarios, which includes the REITs model that addresses some of those issues, and that addresses the least cost from the system perspective, including deployment of storage to compensate for variable renewables. So along with that, standard scenarios also presents emissions metrics, so you can see how emissions decline across the various scenarios with varying levels of renewable energy deployment.
And maybe just clarify what standard scenarios is and how often it's published and where people can find it.
Yes, so standard scenarios is also published annually. It uses the ATB data as an input to the REITs model. So it is, there's a lag as they incorporate the data and do the new model runs. They do 17 different scenarios that vary things like renewable energy costs with the different ATB scenarios, assumptions about transmission build out, assumptions about potential carbon requirements like 100% clean energy by 2035 or 95% clean energy by 2050. And I believe the URL is scenarioviewer.nrel.gov in order to access that data. There's also the Cambium product, which takes a few selected scenarios and runs them through the Plexos model to generate 8760 data such that you can interact with high fidelity models and high fidelity data and import things like future price series for price taker models, such as system advisor model in those out year scenarios.
Thanks for those answers, Brian. The next question is, are there details of the methodology for how NREL is estimating the increase in point of interconnection cost and network upgrade costs for renewables?
Yeah, so we used two sources to come up with that $100 per kilowatt number. One was the spurline costs in the PV benchmark report that underpin the PV costs. And then we also used Lawrence Berkeley National Labs interconnection queued up studies, which has detailed interconnection costs for, I think, 5 of the independent system operators in those markets. They represent costs depending on whether a plant in the queue was ultimately built, was still in the queue and was canceled. And so we're targeting, given what the ATB is meant to represent, we're targeting those active and pending projects, not the canceled projects. And so we combine data from those two sources to come up with that number. I will reemphasize that that number is representative for something that is relatively close to a load center, and these costs are, again, very site specific. And so I would definitely recommend looking into those LBNL resources to get more detailed answers on those types of costs. There were
several questions about adapting the ATB results regionally or internationally. Did you want to respond to those?
Yeah, I would say that that can be very region specific and technology specific. So given the number of questions we got on that, we'll compile some resources and send them out to the ATB email list after the webinar.
Great, thank you. There were also a lot of questions about financial assumptions, and I wonder if you want me to read them specifically, or if you want to kind of run through the financials.
Yeah, I'll run through it with short summaries of each question. So there was one on the assumptions for escalation and any indices. This is a little bit tech specific. So for example, the fossil costs use a chemical engineering plant cost index. Batteries, we used consumer price index since there's a lot of imports. So some of this is documented on the ATB website in terms of which escalation indices were used. As far as what risk is included in the costs, risks are priced into the return on equity. So generally, through our financials research, technologies that were perceived as lower risk, the investors expect lower rates of return on equity, and more nascent technologies tend to have higher returns. For construction, we do represent in the conversion between overnight capital cost and CapEx. We represent different construction timelines for different technologies. So for example, in the nuclear data, each of the different technology advancement scenarios actually uses a different construction timeline to represent uncertainty in construction costs and cost overruns. The next question is on debt interest rates relative to ATB vintages. Yes, so debt went up 3 percentage points between the 2022 and 2023 ATB, recognizing what happened to the 10-year treasury and other debt markets mostly in 2022 and early 2023. The increases in cost of equity relative to the 2022 ATB have been relatively smaller, depending on the technology, between 0.25% and 1%. As far as there was a question on how is transferability concerned in determining the debt to equity ratios. We're still using system advisor models, partnership flip model, which is a tax equity structure. Generally, the research we've been seeing has been showing that larger plants are going with these tax equity structures, depending on exactly the amount of CapEx. That said, it's been really hard to find good data on transferability, and we do get questions like this one about whether transferability would increase the amount of debt for these plants. So if you are in finance, please come talk to us, because we would love to hear more about how that market's evolving. And then curious what you're using for the cash flow during construction for the various technologies. I did answer this a little bit sooner. So within each technology on the ATB, you can see the construction duration that was used and how debt and equity are allocated during construction. We do assume some premiums on debt and equity during construction, but all of that is available in the ATB spreadsheet at the top of each individual technology tab.
So, Brian, there was another question kind of related to the inflation aspect, but also related to the supply chain. And I wonder if you'd like to discuss that in general. And the specific question was with regard to natural gas power plants.
I'm not seeing.
This may go to our adjustments that were mostly done last year to address supply chain cost run-up. So I think if you just want to talk about how we did that.
Yeah, so historically, in additions prior to 2023, the ATB just established a point at the base year and then established their methodology for out year, either using a learning curve or specific analysis years into the future. Those are great questions to ask the analysts in the upcoming breakout rooms. Starting with 2023 and this year as well, we've asked analysts to pay a little bit or include a little bit more data about what happens in that intervening year between the base year, where we have a peer-reviewed published study that we can base our estimates on, and something that might be a little bit more recent when we're developing the data, typically in the February and March timeframe. And so we do try to factor that into the next cost after the base year. I think there was a little bit more of a pronounced supply chain increase last year than there was this year. That's pretty clear from the trajectories. And then generally speaking, the PV analysts have this concept of a market price versus minimum sustainable price. I think not all analysts use that concept, but generally I think it's useful to think of some of the out year projections in the ATB as minimal sustainable prices, because we don't know what's going to happen with the supply chain over the next 5 to 10 years.
And our inflation rate is intended to be a long-term average and not to reflect volatility and recent high inflation. Expectations in the future are to revert to a long-term average.
Yes, and the inflation rate only factors into the financial assumptions for LCOE. All other costs are real costs in 2022 dollars, and so if you're looking for a nominal cost in an out year, please apply inflation assumptions to those costs.
There were some other interesting questions about hydrogen, but I think we're at time. So you could either answer a quick question about what we're doing on hydrogen, or leave that for further discussion.
Yeah, I think the quick answer is that the electricity ATB is considering looking at hydrogen generation technologies for electricity production. So that could include hydrogen combustion turbines or hydrogen fuel cells. It's still very early days. We're just starting our discussions about the 2025 update, so I'm not going to promise anything on those. Electricity ATB would not include costs for, say, electrolyzers. I can say we are considering ATBs for other sectors beyond electricity and transportation, but don't have any firm details to share as to when those might be published. And with that, I think we can transition to the breakout rooms.